we need NodeJS. Okay, and then with NodeJS, there's really two installs that we're going to have to deal with. So NodeJS, you'll have a version of NodeJS on your command prompt. So if I just come out to a terminal window, and I'll blow up the font here, I should be able to see node -- version. And you'll see I'm running version 12.13.1. There's probably a later and greater version of that. On your machines, I think you're running version like 10 something. It should be fine for what we're trying to do. Okay. What's going to happen is when we move over to AWS and we're going to deal with Lambda, and when we deal with Lambda, we're going to be writing Node.js code. You're going to be on a newer version. So you're welcome to download a newer version of Node.js. To download the newest version of Node.js, I'm just going to go out to Chrome and do a search for Node.js. There's a download link. So there's the long-term support version and then the current version, which will have newer features. Super easy download. You just download it, click the installer, agree to the license agreement, and there's nothing really to it. Okay, so we have Node. That's kind of the first step. In order to run Node applications, we're going to want npm, which is the Node package manager. So again, just doing a Google search. So I'm doing an npm search, and there's a link to get npm. And if I go right to npm, I can get Node and npm all together. So it's saying if I want to see if I have npm installed, I should be able to do npm-v to check the version. And you can see I have npm installed. I don't know that you do on your machines. Can someone verify if you do or don't? What's that? Okay, so you're set. So you have npm installed. Okay, so that's a good start. So we have the tools that we need to write our Node.js applications. Okay, so if we just go out to npm, we would get Node, we'd get npm, the installer would install both of those tools, we'd be all set. That's the starting point for Node, and that's going to allow us to run JavaScript applications. All of you have taken the JavaScript class? Okay, so in the JavaScript class, we ran all of our JavaScript through the browser, right? We'd create an HTML page, and then our JavaScript would execute. Node doesn't work that way. Node is server-side JavaScript, okay? But it is JavaScript, so the language is the same. So how we create variables, how we have conditionals, how we loop, all of that's the same, okay? So chances are you have some familiarity with it. Some of the code that you're going to see is more complicated than the code that you would have seen in the first semester class. So we'll go through that today. So you'll have an explanation at least on the syntax. Syntactically, I don't think it's any worse or better. Okay. Okay, so once I have Node and npm installed, I am going to want to create a new project. Okay, so I'm just going to go out to my desktop. So my working directory right now is on my desktop. And what I want to do is I want to create a new directory. So I can do it over here. I could just say create a new folder. See how I use my context menu to create that new folder? And I'm on my desktop in the background. I could also do it from a terminal, but not necessary. So I can just say here's a new folder called Node-Dynamo. Okay, and then from my terminal, I should be able to see that folder. So you'll see that Node-Dynamo. I'm going to change my working directory there. And then what I want to do is I want to initialize a new project in that folder. So the way I'm going to do that is npm. So npm is the command, Node Package Manager, and then I want to initialize a new project. And it's going to ask some questions. So npm space init to create a new Node project that's managed by the Node Package Manager. Okay, so I hit init and it says, what's your package name? Dynamo is the package name, that's fine. Version 1 is fine. A description, first node application connecting to Dynamo. Okay, again, I could just leave all of these as defaults. I don't need a description. My entry point, it's saying which file is going to be your starting point. So I'm saying index.js is fine. I could rename it, so I could choose a different starting point, but that's fine. Test command, a get repository, keywords, author, license. I'm skipping all of that, and it says, hey, you're about to write this file, this package.json file. Is it okay? Yeah, it's fine. So that npm init command created one file, which is package.json. That's all it did. So if I clear my terminal and I do a directory listing, you can see there's just one file in that folder. If I go out to the file system, that's what you'll see is that one file, that package.json file. That package.json file is a result of me running that npm init command. Okay, so the npm init command doesn't really do that much other than create the JSON file, but it does a lot more than that. It allows us to manage packages for our project. Okay, and where that becomes important is since we want to be connecting to DynamoDB, we need to use the AWS SDK, the Software Developer Kit. So it's basically like a class library that's going to allow us to use all of the AWS services in JavaScript. So it's a class library that Amazon built that allows us to use all of the AWS tools. Okay, that's the class library that we need. Okay, so normally, if you're a Java developer, you'd get a jar file that does that. With JavaScript, I don't want that. I'm going to get a node package. Okay, so in order to get that node package, I'm going to use npm install. And the install that I want is the AWS SDK. And then if I actually want that to be persistent, so really what I'm doing here is I'm going to install the SDK and it'll put the SDK in my project. But what I really want to do is I want to modify the package.json to say, in order for my node package to run, in order for my node application to run, I have a requirement of this AWS SDK. That's one of the prerequisite components or dependencies that I have for my node application to run. So what I can do is I can say, go ahead and install it, but then let's go ahead and also save that. So when I hit save, tells me, hey, I added 14 packages from 66 contributors and audited 17 packages, found 0 vulnerabilities. But the reality is if I go out to the file system, you'll notice these node modules. That folder got created. And I can also look at package.json, so I'm just going to open that up with Atom. And you'll notice I have this dependency listed. This AWS SDK dependency. So what ends up happening is if I'm on the file system, let me change over to the file system. If I'm on the file system, my source code files are this package.json, the lock file, and that's really it. This is my project file. Node modules really has nothing to do with my project. That's a dependency that my project has, are the node modules. Okay, so let's say I write all of my source code and I want to commit it into source code repository like Git, or I just want to hand it off to you. I want to put it on Blackboard so that you can see it. I don't have to give you the node modules. So you see how I deleted it from the file system? So it's gone. And the thinking there is that as long as I have npm installed, and as long as I have that package.json file, I can always just come out to the working directory and say, go ahead and go to npm and install any of the dependencies. So I just use that npm install command, and you'll notice that it brought back all of the dependencies. It brought back my node modules. So it reads that package.json file and it says, hey, I have a dependency on the AWS SDK. If I do that npm install, it looks at that package.json file and gets all the required node modules for me. So it brought back that AWS SDK. So it recognizes that the dependencies are not your source code. So if I'm moving my project around, I typically don't move the node modules around. I just give you the package.json file that includes a list of all the dependencies. And then you run that npm install to go grab the dependencies for your machine. Okay, one thing about that is I did run that from my project directory, so that npm install command, it doesn't work from any directory, it works from a node project directory. So I have to have that package.json file in order for that npm install to work correctly. So far, so good? The setup is really not that bad. You're going to run into Node and you're going to run into npm. npm is kind of a big deal in the JavaScript world, so like we're stuck with it. So you're going to see it a couple times. So for us now, we have a project. This is our directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out to Atom and I'm going to open up that project folder. So I'm just going to say, go ahead and add that project folder from my desktop. That Node Dynamo folder. Okay, I don't really need the package.json file. I have the node modules that are going to be required of me. And what I want to do is I want to create a new file that I'm calling index.js. So it's a JavaScript file, and now I can start writing some JavaScript code. So let's get started kind of easily, and then we'll kind of work towards what we actually want to do. So I'm just going to do a console.log cubs stink. All right, this is my version of hello world. Okay, so I want to see that project and I want to see it running. This is just JavaScript code, right? Console.log works. It would normally write to my developer tools. Okay, so I'm skipping over to my terminal and I'm going to issue the command node and then index.js. So I'm running a node application that's JavaScript code, and you'll notice that I get the output cubs stink. Okay. So because it's a JavaScript application, we can have variables. So we can say, you know, here's a team. Right? So we can have a team, and then we can take that variable and grab the corresponding value. So we can take the team name and we can say that they stink. Right? So we can create JavaScript variables, store a value, and then concatenate. And I know some of you are coming right from the first semester JavaScript class, and you're going to say, well, declare the variable and then initialize it on a different line. I don't follow those coding standards. So I don't think you should be either after the first semester. It's kind of nice in the first semester you deal with coding standards and you kind of figure things out, but after that. Okay, so we have a variable and we're concatenating a message. Life's good, it's JavaScript. Okay, and I know maybe you haven't thought about JavaScript this semester, so it's been, you know, maybe a couple months since you've thought about JavaScript, unless you're in a JavaScript class right now. So unless it's fresh on your mind, like it might be new, but I'm confident that you'll catch up. Okay, so for our application, what we want to do is we want to interact with DynamoDB. So in order to interact with DynamoDB, here's some new syntax that you're going to see is I want to create a variable called AWS that's equal to require, and then I'm going to require the AWS SDK. And what that variable is, it's basically like a class library. So I'm saying bring in that class library and call it AWS. So my class now is called AWS. Life's good. Okay, and then we have to configure our version of AWS. So we're going to say config.update, and the way we change our configuration is we're going to specify a region, has to have a region, and honestly, since we're running it locally, and we're going to hit our local database, it doesn't really matter. So US East 1, and then we need a second parameter, which is our endpoint, not endpoint URL. Okay, so I just want to be clear about the syntax because I don't know that you've seen the syntax from your JavaScript class. What's happening here is this update method takes one parameter, right? So instead of a string or a Boolean or a number, the one parameter that it takes is a JavaScript object. So it takes an object with all the options that we want to configure, and the way we then have the various options that we'd configure is with JSON. So we have an object, that's the beginning and ending curly braces, and then we have key value pairs for that object for each of the options. Right? So we're configuring two options, we're configuring the region and the endpoint. So all we're doing is calling a method that takes one parameter, which is an object. Okay, and it looks more complicated because we're passing in an object as opposed to the number 10 or the string, whatever value your string is. We're passing in an object that has some options. Okay? Life's good so far? Okay, from that, then we can create a new variable, which is going to be an instance of our database. So we have a reference to DynamoDB locally, and what we want to do is we want to just query the data, right? And I'm using the wrong terminology. We want to scan the data. I want to see everything that's in my table, which we're going to continue to use that baseball stats local. Okay. So in order to do that, I have to set up some parameters. Our params equal to, and my params again is going to be an object, which basically is going to say that my table name is baseball stats local, and that's it. Right? There's no other data that I have to pass in. If I just want to scan the table, just tell me the table name, you can scan it. I'll give you all the information that I have. It's the only parameter that I have. So this is kind of the simplest statement that I could do in DynamoDB is I want to scan the table and get all the data back. Right? It's also the most expensive because I'm scanning all the records, and if I was scanning it, I'd see the 23 records. Okay, so let's break from code right now. I want to go out to the command prompt and make sure that I can scan and see my 23 records. Okay, so I want to be able to see the actual data that I'm going to bring over to my application so I know what my application should expect. Okay, so I go over to a terminal, and in order for this to run, I have to start up DynamoDB. Right, so DynamoDB is in my AWS folder. And then there's this, I have a run command that's basically that Java command. So I'm just going to run dynamodb.sh /run. Okay, so it's running on port 8000. And then I'm going to open up another tab within my terminal. So here's another tab within my terminal. So I have DynamoDB running, and then I want to scan it. So I'm going to do AWS DynamoDB Scan. The table name that I want is baseball stats local, and then my endpoint URL is going to be the local database instance. This doesn't look very promising. I don't know what came up there. That's bizarre. What happened there? I just want to make sure I have list tables. So I don't have my baseball stats table listed. I'm going to just cheat and go out to Blackboard to grab the table creation script and insert some records. So I'm out in our class website under course content. There's the create table. So I'm just going to take that command and bring it over to Atom and modify it so that I'm using AWS. And then I'm going to create the table. And now if I list the tables, now I should see that second table, baseball stats local. And then I want to import some data. That's out on my desktop, so I'm going to open another tab, changing to my desktop. And then there's the exercise files. And then the exercise files that I cared about were 02_02. I thought they were. And then if I look at these files, it's going to my local database, so I should be able to then use my scripts, again from Blackboard, to use that batch put item. All right, so I can do that with teams, players, and games. Requested resource not found. Why is that not found? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I want to run that on my local machine. Okay, and then I want to do that for teams, games, and players. Okay, then finally, once I have that seed data loaded, I should be able to then scan my table and see my 23 records. Okay, and I always say, you're getting started with Node, and we're going to write some Node code, and we want our Node script to work correctly. I better make sure that everything's working properly locally. Like, I didn't have the database table, and I didn't have any seed data. I had deleted it to create a video, so I didn't reload it. There's no way my code's going to work, right? So when I'm over here trying to write code to scan the database table, I can guarantee my code's not going to work if the table doesn't exist and there's no data in it. All right, so I know that my table exists and I know there's data in it. So now I have it set up so that I have this AWS SDK, I've configured it, I've set the parameters, and I'm ready to issue my scan command. Okay, so the scan command looks like this. I take my DynamoDB instance and I call scan. I pass in the parameters, which are basically what's the table name. And then I pass in one other parameter, which is a callback. And this is where the JavaScript gets a little bit more complicated than what we're used to. The callback is a function that gets invoked when this command is completed. Okay, and that callback gets two parameters. It either gets an error, things didn't go well, or it gets the result set back, the data back. So the way we typically write this is I would have a function definition, which is going to be my callback, that could be an error condition, or I could get data. So basically I'm saying, I want you to go scan the table. I want you to get all of the data from that table. And then when you do, you're either going to be in an error condition or you're going to tell me the data that came back as a result of that scan command. That's how this would read. Okay, so the way we're going to handle it is if there's an error condition, so if this error exists, console.error, the error. If not, we're going to log our data. And we just want to see the data. Does the logic make sense? Honestly, I don't care if the syntax makes sense so much. I just want you to understand the logic that this function right here is going to get invoked upon completion of that call, upon completion of that scan method. So I'm saying scan DynamoDB for this particular table. That's what the params are indicating. So scan it for this particular table. And then when you're done, you either have an error or you got results back from scanning it. If there's an error, just let me know what the error is. If not, then show me what data came back, the results of the scan. Okay, so I think we're set. I want to go to a terminal and run this using a node command. Okay, so from my terminal, I want to change my working directory back to my project folder. Okay, so we have our index.js file. And all I'm going to do is node index.js. Unexpected token semicolon. Yes, semicolon shouldn't be there. It should be on the next line. Just a syntax error. So I have data. Okay, so the data right now it says there's a collection of items, and each one of the items is an object. So let's say I want to know for each of the items. I just want to go through each of the items and print them out, and I want to print out the team ID. Okay, so the team ID is not all that useful. It basically tells me whether it's a player or a game, or tells me whether it's a game or a player or a game, player, or team. Essentially is what that team ID is going to tell me. But we know how to handle that now. So this data is a collection of items. So instead of just logging the data, what if I say for var I equal to 0, I less than data dot, and I think it's items uppercase, dot length, so how many items are there, and then we're going to increment our index, and all I'm going to do is log each items, so data dot items at my index dot team ID. So I'm just looping through. This is just a JavaScript loop. Okay, so I come back over to my terminal, clear the screen. Oops. And you'll notice that each of the team IDs is going to indicate whether it's a team or a game or a player. So I can dig into the data. So maybe I only care about player info. Right? So here's player info. And it's an object. So it has the string and then the game info. I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know what data we actually want to see. Is kind of where I'm stopped. So if I just log the data, maybe I only want to know the player name. Well, player name doesn't exist for all of the objects. Right? So sometimes it's team name, sometimes it's a game. So I just want to log the player name. So the way I'm going to handle it is I just want to log the player name. So my data.items at a particular index may or may not have a player name. So I could run into problems here trying to log the player name. That may or may not exist. JavaScript doesn't care. Okay, so JavaScript will say, yeah, it's undefined, undefined, undefined. So if I literally just want the players and I don't want the undefined message, I can check, does this exist, and then log it. Okay, and then I'll just get the players that I care about. Okay. Fair? Okay, so let's try to insert a new record. So we can have a table of player data or team data without the Brewers or Christian Yelich, right? Like we want to add that record. So what I want to do is I want to write another script that's going to allow us to insert a record. Okay, and a lot of it's going to be the same stuff, but it's a little bit different. Okay, so I want to insert a new record. my record, I want to match kind of the structure. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to go open that seed data. So we know that we seeded our table with data from our exercise files. So we have player information here. So we know that our item looks like this. Okay, and I'm going to cheat because I know that our player looks like that. So I'm going to create a new file, which is a file called createplayer.js. And I'm just going to put a comment here. I don't know what I hit. Okay, so that's what my player is going to ultimately look like. That's the JavaScript object that I'm going to create in order to have an item. Okay, so then I can take some of the code that we used from index.js. I know that I'm going to need the AWS SDK. I know that I'm going to have to do this configuration update to indicate that I'm running against my local database. I know that I'm going to have to create an instance of DynamoDB. I know that I'm going to have params. So let's start there. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that over to my new file. And that's going to be my starting point. Okay, in order for me to insert a new player, so I want to insert Christian Yelich for the Brewers. Okay, so in order for me to do that, I have to create my item, which I have up above. But I really don't need the item. What I really need is this stuff on the right-hand side. So I create this object called player. It has a team ID, a sort key, a player name, and a position. So our player info is going to be for Milwaukee, MIL. I don't know his number, to be honest with you. I should, but I don't. And then he plays right field. Okay, so that's the record that we want to insert into our database table. Okay, so our params now changes a little bit. So we have our table. We want to insert the record into baseball stats local, but then we want an item, which is going to be our player. That's what we're inserting. So the parameters are basically like everything I need to run the command. And everything I need to run the command if I'm doing an insert is what table and what information am I inserting. Okay, and that's all of those parameters. Okay, if that's the case, then I should be able to go to my DynamoDB instance, and then there's a put item method. And the put item method takes your parameters and then your callback. Your callback being either it was successful, the record was inserted and there was not an issue, or there's an error. Okay, so same exact setup. I have to supply a function that can manage that. So here's a function. There's either an error that occurs or I get back data because it was successful. So that same callback mechanism. Okay. It's the same exact callback mechanism that you saw from the scan. So we have the scan, we have a function that either errors out or I get back results. Same thing here when I'm creating a new player. It either errors out or I get back results, like a confirmation. So I'm going to handle that. If error, so if there was an error, output that error. Otherwise, I'm going to log, and I'll put it in else. Player was successfully created. The data that comes back is just an empty object, I believe. So if I log the data, sorry. The data is not very exciting. I expect it to insert successfully. So now I'm going to go back to a terminal to issue this command. So node create player.js. And you'll notice the data that actually came back is just an empty object. And it tells me that it was successfully created. We can verify that now with our code, right? Because we have code that will list all of the players, which is my index. And you'll notice the first record is Christian Yelich. I was looking at the bottom. I'm like, uh-oh, it didn't insert it, but it's inserted. What if we wanted to insert a team? So essentially, I'm going to copy all of this, right? I'm going to create a new file and paste in exactly what we had before. The only thing different is instead of inserting a player, we're inserting a team now, right? So this variable player becomes team. Oops. I'll save it as create team.js. And then instead of my item being a player, it's that team. And again, I'm kind of cheating here a little bit in that I'm coming out to the exercise files, and I just want to look at the format of what a team looks like. So if I open that with Atom, the format of a team is this thing right here. So when I create a team, this is how I want to create the team. Except I don't want the Angels, I want Milwaukee. My sort key is going to be MIL, and then it's going to be the Milwaukee Brewers. So the only thing I changed was this variable from player to team. I updated it in my parameters, and then my message should probably be different. The team was successfully created. Okay, so now I come back over to the terminal window, and I want to run that command, create team. I don't have any way to see the teams easily, so I'm just kind of arrowing up so I can scan that table. Because at one point we scanned the table. And you'll notice here's the player, so here's Yelich, and here's the team info for the Brewers. Why does it end up there? Like, you'll notice it's not at the beginning, not at the end. It's kind of right in the middle. It's based on this team ID and sort key about where it hashes that record and stores it. So it's not always going to concatenate at the beginning, it's not always going to concatenate at the end. It's going to position it. It's a sorted record set based on the inserts. So it hashes that and says this is where it belongs in memory so that it can retrieve it and it knows where it should be in memory. So I'm not moving records around. Okay. What if I wanted to delete a record? Okay, and let's say, so I use put item to insert a new record for the team and for the player, and then for the index we just used our scan method. What if I want to delete a record? I could just guess, right? It's delete. Is that fair? Or I can go out to AWS and look at the documentation and say, I want to know the AWS DynamoDB SDK. That's what I'm searching for. And then you'll notice the SDK occurs in Java, Golang, Python, C#. I really want the SDK for JavaScript because we're writing JavaScript code. Okay, and here's the API. Okay, so we're looking at DynamoDB, and then I can grab the latest version of that. Here's the methods, delete item. That looks pretty good. And you'll notice the delete item takes parameters and a callback. Okay, so it's going to look a lot like our create player, right? So let's say we decide we don't want Yelich in the database anymore. We want to get rid of him. Okay, so I go ahead and I'm going to create a new file called deleteplayer.js. Right, so I copied and pasted all of the same information that I used for the insert. My player is going to be from Milwaukee. My sort key is going to be that number. That's the player. When I'm doing a delete, that's all I can give it. So I don't know if I communicated this effectively enough, but with DynamoDB, if we're comparing it to a relational database has unique primary keys. A DynamoDB has a unique hash key and a unique sort key. Like those two, now I have a composite key. Those two things have to be unique. So my unique record is the fact that the player's from Milwaukee and his number is 27. And I told you that's the wrong number, but that's what's in the database. So that's the player that I care about. I don't care about the rest of the data. It has no impact on my delete. Okay? So I'm just giving it a key. My parameters are still going to be the same table and same player, so that doesn't change. But instead of a put item, I issue a delete item command. So I'm saying delete that record that has this hash key, with the team ID being player info from Milwaukee, and the player number being 27. Okay, the only thing I'm really updating is the fact that we're not doing a put item, we're doing a delete item. And again, I either get an error or I get results back, and it's not player was successfully created, it's player was successfully deleted. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. I should be able to come out to my terminal and run that deleteplayer.js. Uh-oh. The issue that I'm running into is it's not asking for a player. So if I click on this delete item, you'll notice that it doesn't ask for a player, it asks for the key. I have to do the same thing. I have to issue a key. So instead of having an item, I have to say, here's the key for the player that I want to delete. If I want to use the player, it's fine, but the reality is I need to specify that the team ID is equal to player info Milwaukee, and then the sort key is 27. And I probably have this wrong. I think I probably have to issue the type as well, so you'll notice they have the type of key. So it's more complicated than this. I have to say that this player info is a string. And same thing here. The sort key is also a string. Those are my parameters, not that there's a player. Okay, so now I'm defining, if I'm going to do a delete, here's the key. The primary key, or the hash key and the sort key together. That's the composite key. So the parameters are different. So now I come back over to my terminal, clear the screen, try to issue the delete. And life's good. If I try to scan this now, you'll notice that I'm one record short. Christian Yelich should no longer be in here. The Brewers are still in here, but Christian Yelich is gone. I think they're right back to back. So you'll notice that that record is gone. So we can create, we can delete, we can add, we can list, right? I'm skipping the update because update's kind of a pain. And really the reason I'm bringing this up is because kind of our next unit is going to be Lambda. So Lambda is going to allow us to execute code where we don't have to set up the environment. So we don't need to necessarily know that we're running Node.js on a Mac and have our local database installed. Like, we just want to execute our code. And there's all sorts of different options. So I could run C#, I could run Java, I could run Python, but we're running JavaScript. So we have some examples of some JavaScript working. And what I want to do is I want to take these examples over to Lambda and make them run on Lambda. Okay, so one thing about Lambda, and I just went through this for the advanced JavaScript class. So in the advanced JavaScript class, one of the projects I have you do is you are basically managing a to-do list. So you get a to-do list and you have to manage that list. So you can add items to it, you can delete items from it, you list all the to-do tasks that you would have. So very similar to what we did where we're creating, we're listing, we're deleting. So very similar, except it's just different data. It's to-do items. Okay? So I'm going to take you out to my AWS console and show you one of the issues that comes up. There's other issues that come up, but this is an important one when we're coding. Okay, so I have 3 different methods in Lambda. These are kind of corresponding to the methods that we wrote today, right? How do I get all the players, or how do I get all the info? That's my all tasks. How do I create? How do I delete? So those are corresponding to those methods. If I go into all tasks, okay, and don't worry about it now. So right now it's running in Node. So you'll notice what ends up happening is I have the AWS SDK. I update it. I create the DynamoDB client. I set all the parameters. And then I query it. But you'll notice that my query looks different. So I'm using a query as opposed to a scan because I only want specific records. So I'm querying instead of scan, but you'll notice it looks different. It's not params and then a callback. It's params and then I get a promise back from it. Here's the reality is, in Lambda, the JavaScript's all asynchronous. So what ends up happening is if I don't return a promise, if I try to return that callback, so if I just have a callback function here, what happens is I hit my return statement before I ever get the callback executed. So when it's complete, execute the callback function. Well, the reality is I hit the return statement before I get the callback. So I don't get any data. So basically, I have to tell this JavaScript code to say, sit here and wait for a second. I need you to wait until you get the data, until you get the results back, whether it was successful or not successful. And then once I do, I get data back and I can return that data. But everything else looks the same, right? So there's some additional complexities when we go over to Lambda, and it's not necessarily easy to debug. But what I really want to point out with this Lambda function is that it looks the same as the code that we wrote for 90% of it. It's 90% the same, 10% different. And my experience over 20 years of development is everything's that way. It's 90% the same, and then it's 10% different, and a lot of people will give up on that 10% that is different. Like, let's say you're a Java developer and you upgrade from the latest version of Java to the next version of Java. 90% of it's the same or more, but then you have the new features that you have to deal with. If you knew the 90% already, like, you're way ahead of everyone. You know 90% of the language. Like, you just have to figure out what the new 10% is. Right? It's not that big a deal to upgrade. But if you wait through like 3 upgrade cycles, so you step away from Java for 3 or 4 years, now it's pretty different. And same thing here, it's pretty different. We know 90% of it. Like, that's what we did in class. We knew 90% of it. Now we just have to figure out, like, how is Lambda different than what traditional Node is? And the reality is it's not different. It's just doing some different things. Okay, so the code that we wrote today that I'm going to post on Blackboard will get us 90% of the way there. So the big thing is promises. Like, I have to deal with promises because it's asynchronous. The other thing that we're going to run into is for that project that you see in advanced JavaScript, you basically tell me your student ID, and you get a task list based on your student ID. So each student has their own task list. So you'll notice that I have this event.student. It's a URL parameter from API Gateway. So basically, I'm defining, like, how does that incoming data actually get here? So how does it show up in API Gateway? How do you tell me what your student ID is? And you have to append it onto a URL. So that's different to how do I get incoming data to my functions will be a little bit different. So we didn't really cover that with the scripts that we wrote today, is how do we get incoming data? Like, how would we prompt the user to say, enter a name, enter a player, enter a team? We didn't do that. And the reason we didn't do that is because ultimately I want them doing it over the web anyway. So if you're curious how this all hooks up, like, I'm kind of giving you a big picture look at all of this right now. If I go back over to API Gateway, so we're going to cover Lambda and we're going to cover API Gateway as kind of our next 2 services that we're going to run into. So now I'm going over to API Gateway, and I have an API that I built that's wired up to those Lambda functions. And basically what this is a RESTful API. So same URL, but then I call the methods using different HTTP verbs. We'll cover all of this. But if I want to say, you know, give me a list, so this get is going to allow me to test it. So I have to specify a student. I think I only have my data in there. And then I test it. And I see my items. I get eat pizza, whether or not it's completed, and then walk the dog. There's 2 records that come back from that task list for me. If I type in another student ID, then there's not going to be any result sets. And the data is stored in DynamoDB. Okay? And the way this ends up working is if I actually look at the stages, there's a task stage, so I get a URL that's out on the internet. This doesn't work very well, but if I pass in my ID, then I get that corresponding data. So I can supply a URL to my application. My application can bring back this data and then build out the list, or however I want to display these tasks. Okay, is the idea. So this is what we're going to build. So I need Dynamo so I can store data. Then I'm going to need to code against it like we just did today. There's not that many changes in Lambda about how I code against the database. But Lambda is way more powerful than what we're going to get into in this class, but you'll get the idea. We're writing a JavaScript application on top of Lambda so that we can access that DynamoDB database. And then those Lambda functions are not accessible outside of the Amazon ecosystem unless I open them up through the API gateway. So basically, I'm providing access to those Lambda functions over the internet using API gateway. So those are kind of the next two services that we're going to hit is how do we write the code in Lambda, and then how do we expose the code over the internet so that people can actually run those methods, run those commands that we wrote today. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I'm going to post the source code that we used today. And the idea is that as long as you have that seed data for that baseball stats local, you should be able to issue those commands with Node. Okay, so I'm not going to include the Node packages. I'm only going to include that package.json file. So just as a reminder, if I'm out on a terminal and I'm in that project folder, so right now I'm going to remove the node modules, so rm our node modules, so that directory's gone. This is what I'm going to put onto Blackboard as these JavaScript files along with package.json. In order for this to work, so if I try to just run this right now, node index.js, it's going to fail. See how it fails? Because it doesn't know where that AWS SDK is. In order for that to work, I have to run the npm install command. Okay, so now I've installed npm, or I've run the install command. It grabbed the AWS SDK. If I do my directory listing, you'll see the node modules are back. And now my node command, sorry, I didn't need to do that again. Now my command to list the records will run. So I'm removing node modules. So my directory looks like so. And then I'll post that whole directory. So the first thing you're going to have to do to run the sample code is that npm space install. Okay? I'm going to stop here.